Hi, everybody. So maybe you can make me co-host again.
Yes,
That way
I'm
I
about
can
to do
share
that.
my slides. So thanks for coming back, everybody. This is our fifth session, which means that we are over a third of the way done already, and time flies, I guess, when you're having fun. So I think I can share my screen now. Great. All right, everybody can see that pretty well, right?
Yep.
Okay, so today's topic is going to be tribal tips to tackle certain exposures and impacts. That was a little bit of a tongue twister there, but this basically means we're going to have a little different of a format today. Let me tell you about it. Our outline today, we will start like usual with just kind of regrouping and talking about our suggested reading, having a little discussion, and then I'll have a little lesson for us, just some of the materials from Tribal Climate Health Project that we typically share when we talk about exposures and impacts. And we're very fortunate we have two speakers today, and I'll introduce them in just a little bit. They're going to talk to you about how they're tackling certain exposures within their tribe. So we're going to kind of do a little deep dive case study for 10 minutes each. And then that's the first hour. The second hour, we're going to spend in exposure breakout. So I'll tell you a little bit more about how that works, but we get to dive in deep on your experiences and what have you learned? What successful strategies are you implementing within your tribe to tackle each of the 5 exposures for today? So I think this will be a fun lens with which to look at tribal adaptation. And in particular, we're going to be talking a lot about the health impacts. Okay, so since our last webinar, we have continued to just kind of send materials out your way. If you want to review them, you're free to, things like the Wisdom Well or the recordings. And then if you are following along with us, we are, we've been sending out a worksheet every time, so you're free to add your reflections and follow along in that worksheet. In fact, Tina, if you wouldn't mind adding that worksheet into the chat. So worksheet 5 is available. It was emailed out to you as well. You might take a minute to just download that for yourself, so you can be grabbing some of your own reflections as we walk through things today. And with that, I think we should move into our suggested reading, which was actually the Status of Tribes and Climate Change report that came out in 2021. And it's a large report, so we just picked out one chapter. So we picked chapter 5, which was on health and well-being. And our very own Shasta Gahn, I think, was an author. We're certainly mentioned in there. So Shasta, do you want to do a little intro here?
Sure. So I was one of the contributing authors to this chapter, not the lead author, but of course, given the work that we're doing with the Tribal Climate Health Project, it was a good fit for me to contribute some to this chapter. So I hope you got a chance to look at it. And the chapter primarily discusses not just health and well-being writ large as physical impacts, but also what is specific to tribal communities and what needs to be considered in terms of helping tribes to adapt to climate change, or just recognizing both the resilience and also the different struggles that tribal communities face when it comes to climate change and health. So if anybody has any comments that they want to make on the reading, or if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet, that's okay too. I know how busy we all are. But looking at those key messages that are on the slide, if anybody has any comments or observations that you want to make about the social and emotional health, or any of the foods or medicines that are being affected by climate change in your area, please feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and give us some of your perspective.
And Shasta, I'm sorry, Tina, it might be a good time to drop the link in for the reading. So if anybody hasn't had a chance to look.
Yes, Lori.
Hey, thanks. I was glad this was assigned as the reading, because I read it before when it came out, but I haven't read it for a while. And the part that got to me was the resilience. I've seen tribes that have been banging their heads for years against climate change and impacts, and I'm just now starting to see movement on the other side. And for me, that's hopeful. The Pomo tribes have been working to save the hitch, which is an endangered species and a tribally important species. And they're getting movement now. And that's the kind of thing that encourages me is when I see that movement, even though it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. I feel the same. And even for me, the very act of participating in writing this chapter really, it can be both a little bit depressing because you see all the things that we're facing, but it also brings hope because we can see all of the movement that tribes are making to make things better for their communities. So that was definitely a big point for me. And I want to note, Kimberly put in the chat, yeah, it's 371 pages. You're right, it's huge. You open it and you're like, holy cow, I don't want to read this whole thing, but you can take it chapter by chapter or even go through the table of contents. All of the chapters actually have case studies from tribes. And sometimes that's the best part to read, is to hear directly from a tribe that was willing to share and have their experiences published in the report to talk about their resilience or their strategies or, even their challenges. The whole point of this report was it's meant to be for people who don't work with tribes to help them understand what is going on and why you can't just have a one-size-fits-all solution for climate adaptation when it comes to tribal communities. So I'm looking at our list of participants and I see that a couple of you are unmuted and yet I don't know if you wanted to talk, but Zoe, I saw, oh, Zoe, did you just remute yourself?
Yeah.
Well, now that you're on the spot, do you have any comments you want to make about tribes and health or this chapter?
Not right now. I'm just taking notes on what everybody else is saying.
All right, that's fine. That's great. And Kimberly asked another question: is there any way to get a hard copy? Unfortunately, no. The decision was made by the steering committee for this that it would be online only rather than printing up a bunch of copies and having them not all necessarily be distributed. So we wanted to make it as green as possible by putting it online. But, of course, if you have the capacity to print 371 pages, you could always print it. But that is a lot to print. So I would just, if you have things you want to print, I would print bite-sized pieces, just print a chapter. Kendra.
Yeah, let me get to my notes here. I love this chapter. I thought it was really easy to read and lots of it resonated with me because I am relatively new. I've been working around tribes since 2009, but I've only been working with a tribe for about 2.5 years and really engaged in the middle of their philosophies. And I'd say the message that resonated the most to me is that health and well-being are founded on mutually beneficial relationships. And it's something that we see all the time in the tribe, how they're working with each other, but also with the wider community, even though much of the wider community is very racist. And it also, it's part of why they are working so hard to try to find out how to do co-stewardship and co-management on the land, which is really hard because we don't have federal lands around us and the state doesn't recognize the tribes in Alaska. So, but I was also really struck by things like where for indigenous people, the world has ended many times before. This is what elders have been telling me. All these things that happened and people were already living here. And then also about the language, about the covenant between the creator and the people. And again, things that I've been hearing a lot of since I've been with the tribe. So I really enjoyed reading this.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that. And I see Melanie, you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I just had a couple of comments on it. I think everyone else is covering the positives and how great it was. But I did have a couple of comments regarding some deficiencies. So one comment would be to take flooding, which is happening right now that we've had every other natural disaster up here. I'm up in Humboldt County. And it's kind of interesting because a lot of tribes are in full support of many of the restoration projects, and many of those will result in flooding in areas that were not flooded,
Yeah.
so-called drain the swamp and put the soil in and everything. And that's kind of been reversed, and in a big way up here, millions and millions of dollars of money for that. And so there's kind of an interesting situation where there's full support for those natural systems being restored, but at the same time being affected by the climate change that is occurring at the same time as those restorations. And one thing that I thought was really missing that is related to that is that historically tribes would move. And now that the ancestral territories are, in name only in most cases, tribes are on pretty small rancherias that were oftentimes kind of randomly chosen. That opportunity is missing, and I feel like that should really be addressed. When you're looking at where tribes should be placed, there was no thought to seasonal changes or climate changes, and there are many tribes living on reservations that are going to be quite drastically affected by climate change, and in the first time in their histories, they're not able to move to another place without spending millions of dollars, and in some cases not even possible because it's a private holding and the owners aren't willing to sell. So I understand that not everything can go into a report, and so I don't want to be critical, but I just thought that was something that should be discussed. And that's all.
Thank you, Melanie. And that is an excellent point. And I honestly don't remember what part of the stack report talks about relocation and that kind of movement, but it's certainly something that needs to be talked about more and considered. And well, I'm glad we're having some good discussion here. And Melanie, I'm going to let you have the final word before we move on to our next section of the day. So Melanie, go ahead.
Thank you, Shasta. I really, in looking at this chapter, when you talked about the social emotional components, particularly for me, I work with youth, and it's so complex because so many things are happening, and we can detail all the things happening. We recognize that people are being effective, but how do we mitigate that? How do we come in and build strength with our young people? And it's a double-edged sword I'm dealing with, where we want to educate them and create these young leaders. And at the same time, what happens is in their 20s, they're like, well, I've been a leader for 10 years. I'm a little burnt out now. And they're not seeing the change. And to keep that climate hopefulness up, and it's just a trick. It's a tricky balance. I just wanted to kind of mention, when I read through this, that was something I'm always aware of and cognizant with my young people, but I appreciate that it was in here talking about the mental health and well-being.
Yes, 100%. Thank you, Melody. And yeah, I find the same thing. Our poor youth are like, they hear all these messages of the youth will save us, these youth leaders. And they're like, oh gosh, that's a big burden to put on young shoulders. So we got to be recognizing that and giving them as much support as we possibly can. So, Angie, I'm going to turn it back to you so we can have today's mini lesson.
Yeah, sounds good. That was a really great conversation, guys. And just so you know, Melanie, I'm going to think about what you said and maybe include it in an adaptation plan I'm working on, because it's very rare. The idea of not being able to roam as freely as they used to be able to is a really important point. I think I'm really hearing you. So we're going to talk about more about all the stuff you guys just talked about. It's all very relevant to today's webinar. And so the topic again today was going to be really on diving into these exposures. So we have some slides here. I have a lot of slides here, and fortunately for you, I'm not going to go through them all, but they're here because I want you to have access to them. This is sort of our standard curriculum when we talk through all the 5 exposures, the primary exposures. So it follows the framework that we've mentioned here before. So the Tribal Climate Health Project developed this framework on the left. It's sort of built to show that the drivers of climate change are creating cascading effects. Those show up as a set of primary exposures that we think of in terms of categories like temperature extremes, wildfire, storms and flooding, drought, melting ice, and sea level rise. And from there, we see cascading effects. So including secondary exposures, meaning things that are coming to us, that are coming into contact with our community, we're not necessarily in control of. These are changing climate conditions. And these will also lead to secondary exposures, including changes to air quality, vector changes, water insecurity, and food insecurity. And all of those things, when they come into contact with our community, will have impacts on our natural environment, our built environment, our health and social environment. And the Tribal Climate Health Project thinks of these things holistically, knows that those things are connected, that the natural environment, the built environment, and the health and social environment are all interconnected, and that the health and social environment has some nuance that oftentimes Western communities don't think about when they talk about health. And so we like to look at it from human health, which looks like physical and mental health, cultural, spiritual health, and socioeconomic health. So we're gonna, in these next slides, it's just gonna wet your whistle on a couple of these exposures to show you how we think about those cascading effects and how they impact in these multitude of ways. So we'll start with temperature extremes here as an example. When we talk about temperature extremes, we often think of heat, but we're talking about cold events too. But high temperature records are far outweighing low temperature records, although this winter you may want to disagree by now. But we see here, according to the 2017 Climate Science Special Report, average annual temperatures in the United States have increased already by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit and are projected to increase 2.8 to 7.3 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And this is a good one to put first because all of us are going to experience this to some level. Those in the Southwest are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat. And so these are just little boxes at the bottom just to reflect as we go. Knowing, and this is like a very short version of these climate conditions, some facts about changing climate conditions. But what health impacts can you anticipate thinking about things warming up to this level? Not to say out loud, but just think about it. We'll just jump right into what we think. And then we're going to hear from you all a little bit later. Possible health impacts. So we'll first kind of walk through some of the physical and mental health impacts, and then we'll talk a little bit about the social, economic, and cultural impacts. And so obviously you all know about things like heat-related illness and death. There's some charts on the right, but I'm really just kind of walk through these kind of quickly because I'm jogging you to think through how these impacts might actually be affecting your tribe. When we get into breakouts, we're going to use the same structure, these 5 exposure areas, and you're going to get to share your experience. It could look like a decrease in fitness activity levels because it's very hot out and we're no longer really outdoors as much as we would like to be. There's changes to behavioral, mental, and cognitive well-being, including research showing that there's increased conflict, violence, and aggression in extreme heat conditions. A lot of the tribes that I work with talk about power outages out here in California, which limits access to health services, and it can also result in carbon monoxide poisoning for those tribes that may be on backup diesel. And that's a real issue for folks who might be on electricity-dependent medical equipment, such as a ventilator or dialysis, and especially in all of these, especially difficult for those that are most vulnerable. And then we think about, well, those cascading effects, right, to the secondary exposures that we talked about. Well, there's lots of those when it comes to heat. There's a relationship here between extreme heat and ozone. Ozone is an air pollutant. It's occurring already, but it's exacerbated by extreme heat conditions. We might see changes in allergens, pollen levels, and distribution and seasonality of allergies. Ticks and mosquitoes, their seasonality and distribution and breeding patterns change in extreme heat or different seasonalities. As the heat months extend, sometimes now many more months than they used to. I'm working with a tribe right now that's like, it used to stop getting so hot in September and now it's still hot at Thanksgiving. And so what will that do to things like vectors? Water contamination, we see changes in pathogens that might get into the water systems when it's too warm, such as harmful algal blooms and other kinds of pathogens, and supply disruptions, as well as food contamination and supply disruptions, when particularly when things get extremely hot. But if you think about extreme cold as well, you might be looking at things like frost, changing frost conditions that might hurt crops. Some of you might be experiencing that this winter. So what health impacts can you anticipate from these changes? Well, we look at things like respiratory illness, allergic symptoms from pollen, infections and illness from contaminated water and food. Like I mentioned, algal blooms. Well, that could hurt humans directly. It could hurt the marine life that sometimes serves as a food source. And all these things could, those changes could change nutritional abundance, medicinal abundance, and those have health impacts as well. Like I said, I'm breezing really quickly through just to kind of give you a teaser and get you thinking about how these kinds of exposures may affect health. And then, looking beyond physical health, possible impacts to social, economic, and cultural health. We might be looking at things like, with the power outages or extreme heat, or actually extreme cold, you might be looking at lost school days, right? Where your kids just are losing out on economic opportunity. You might be seeing economic damage, whereas same thing, if you've got closures of businesses, say some of your critical economic facilities, you might be losing revenues that's critical to economic drivers and critical to the well-being of the tribal members. And then, we look at damage, disturbance, or loss of access to traditional resources and cultural resources and cultural well-being. And when I do this with a tribe, I'm looking at both within the reservation and throughout the ancestral lands. Though a tribe may not have jurisdiction necessarily over the cultural resources that are affected outside of a reservation, they are certainly still something that I consider an interest and belong in an adaptation plan. Things like if there's something on the coast, I say this is an inland tribe, but they used to be on the coast, and there's cultural resources there on the coast that are going to be affected by sea level rise. We should think about those and those losses as being a negative and adverse harm to cultural well-being. And so for heat, we think of things like heat or season shifts that could create some disruptions, declines, and stresses to habitats, waterways, and important and sensitive plant and wildlife species. And those things are important to cultural well-being. And then on another side on culture, just as these, all these exposures have some ability to potentially displace tribes, threatening their sovereignty and their community cohesion. And we've had some good discussions in this group about relocation and all that, but I'm not saying that it should happen, but just saying that that is a potential threat to health. And so I'm just going to kind of pop in here with wildfire for just a second, and we're not going to go through the rest of these. So, wildfire, we're going to have a speaker on this in just a minute, actually, who's going to talk in detail about their experience with wildfire. But that's getting worse, right? And especially for the Western United States, especially since the 1980s. The tribes I work with tell me that they know when the patterns begin to change, more intense, longer fire seasons, more frequent, and it's projected to get worse. So lots of health impacts to consider, but you're starting to see even some repetition. But in this case, we think even about injury and death. We have seen this out here in California. We've certainly seen people die recently in some of our big fires. Lots of mental health impacts. There was a study in 2003 that showed that a third of adult survivors of California wildfires suffered depression and a quarter had PTSD. And then there's lots throughout the rest of these exposures, lots of health risks due to the disruption of critical public services and infrastructure. So that's a lot of things, like wildfire might disrupt your transportation services or your roads. You might not have access to help in emergency services. Those facilities might get damaged. You might be able not to be able to get the services in or the people to the services, or access to electricity dependent medical equipment, again, for example, when power goes out. Here we look at triggered secondary exposures, including smoke. A big one here is smoke, affecting air quality. And that, of course, going to translate into some health effects. More relationships here with vectors, water contamination, food contamination, supply disruptions. And so, yeah, I think I'll just leave it there because we're going to move into some speakers that are going to tell us a little bit more about how these exposures are directly affecting them. And then we're going to have breakouts where you get to talk all about it. But you'll have access to all these slides. So say you want to do an adaptation plan and you want to just have a quick reference to some possible impacts to health. Here you go. Feel free to use this as a starting point. We have lots of other materials that can help as well. You'll see, so I'm going to scroll through here. We got them on all these exposures, lots of just good cliff notes here, and you'll have access to all that. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first participant speaker and say a big thanks to John Gomez, who offered to speak to us about his experience as the environmental director for the Ramona Band of Coahuila here in California. And I think he's going to talk about wildfire specifically and talk about how they're handling the exposure within their tribe and some strategies that they're using. So John, I'm happy to drive the screen and you can take it from here.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here again. And I was so glad that the readings and even what you presented today kind of melds in with what I'm presenting and what I can give in 10 minutes. Once again, my name is John Gomez. I'm the environmental director for the Ramona Band of Coahuila. Prior to that, I was a project manager as well as a cultural resources manager. So I have a lot of background with the tribe in various different departments. You can go ahead and go to the next one. Let's see. Go for it. What I want to talk about is kind of some of the strategies that the tribe developed to address climate change and how that affected how we should deal with wildfires, because the tribal members, the tribal elders realize that wildfires in where they live in their lands were more likely to happen than not, especially with climate change and different practices that were being conducted by other agencies that were not tribal, but that did affect the tribe. So we're going to look at some strategies, the objectives to protect the people, property, and resources of the tribe, including the reservation and lands outside the reservation, because those are also important. The resources that are not directly under the jurisdiction of the tribe are just as important, and if not more so, to try and protect and preserve from impacts. Talk a little bit about some planning, long-term and short-term plans to address and or mitigate against wildfires, and other plans that the tribe developed to assist with that process. And then exercising, having trainings. Some of the stuff that you, Angie, just talked about, when you're developing plans for the wildfires, you look at, or at least the tribe looked at, the direct impacts, how to prevent, then the direct impacts, what to do during, and then there was a little bit after, but the long-term impacts of a wildfire after it happens to the health and welfare of not only the land, but also the people, and the resources are important. And sometimes that gets lost when you develop your action plans to address wildfires. Next slide. Sorry, Angie, can you go to the next slide? I'm sorry. All right. So basically what the reservation looked at is that a threat of a wildfire was a reality. We assumed it's going to happen sooner rather than later. The area around the reservation and on the reservation has not burned in over 80 plus years. However, the reservation is surrounded by forested lands that have become overgrown, lands that are under the jurisdiction of the United States Forest Service and the BLM. And as people know, especially in California, cultural burns had been prevented for a long time in the West, meaning burns that tribes had traditionally used to keep forests healthy and to do away with invasive growth, and actually helped to thwart the spread of wildfires if it did occur. Also, we had to deal with the fact that the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM had done little to no fuels reduction in the area around the reservation. So they weren't really concerned with the impacts of their policies on the reservation or the resources. And as I said, the drought, especially over the last 20 years, had dried up fuels on and around the reservation. This was something that would cause a wildfire to not only start, but spread and impact the people and the resources there. Next slide, please. Great. So the objective that the tribe, the tribal council and the people within the tribe was based on protecting the people, the property, and the resources. And this had to do with the health and safety of all the people that lived there, worked there, that came to visit, and all the important resources, whether it's gathering areas, water sources, cultural sites, all of those were important to the tribe and were important for the tribe to try and protect against wildfire and its impacts. And I was fortunate to start working for the tribe in 2006 when they started to develop a plan to address wildfires. And one of the discussions that that was really interesting was, what are you going to protect first, and how are you going to protect the things that you've decided were most important, and then how are you going to protect the rest of it? And those determinations took a lot of thought. And although the remote band is a small, or has a small land base, there's about 560 acres in the San Bernardino National Forest. There are traditional villages, there are homes, there's infrastructure. The tribe is totally off grid. There are water sources, so everything that was important to the tribe was there. And for them to try and make determinations as to what needed to be protected first and how to protect that was kind of drove the planning stages. And we'll go to the next slide. So one of the things that the chairman said is, if we fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I think we may have heard that before in different forums or in different contexts, but that's especially true, I think, with wildfire. Identifying the threats and what the tribe wishes to protect, those were important. How to protect them was very important. But coming up with long-term, short-term, and then other types of plans to mitigate against wildfires, whether it's something that's caused naturally, like a lightning strike, or if it's something that's started by man, arson or accident or just careless practices. The man-made ones were especially of concern to the tribe because of the proximity to forested lands. And you have campgrounds, and of course you have issues with regards to the Forest Service not doing fuels reduction. And sometimes people don't put out their fires correctly, or they use equipment that they're not supposed to use during dry times, and that can cause a wildfire. So planning to help to mitigate the threat and the impacts of a wildfire was important, both in the long term and the short term. Next slide, please. So long-term planning, what the tribe looked at was identifying activities or projects that they could take several years from now or implement that will require continued maintenance to remain effective. Some examples of these types of planning and even implementation was development of a FEMA compliant multi-hazard mitigation plan, construction of fuel breaks. The construction of fuel breaks was especially important for the remote event because the Forest Service and the BLM lands were hadn't been treated in such a long time that the fuel breaks allowed the tribe to kind of create a buffer or around its homes and the reservation itself to try and stop or at least slow down a wildfire if it occurred in that area. We also looked at removal of invasive plant species. Improvement of infrastructure was very important because we're totally off grid, so everything up there is solar and wind generated, and we had one road in and out of the reservation, which until 2013 was a dirt road. So maintaining the road and then improving it to something that we have now, which is completely paved, was important, not only for this health and safety of the tribal members and people that go there, but to ensure that responders have a safe way to access and leave the reservation if they have to get there. One thing that's important in all the planning stages, but especially in the long-term planning, was identifying resources for these activities and projects. And BIA, FEMA, NRCS, the Forest Service, Environmental Protection Agency, Cal OBS, tribal funds, and other funding sources were looked at to help the tribe in both the long-term and short-term planning, and even some of the other plans, because truthfully, the tribe didn't have and still doesn't have the funds in and of itself to implement the strategies that it would like to, and to continue the strategies that it has put in place to protect the lands and the people and the resources. And then, of course, once you've developed the plan and looked at mitigation activities that you can implement and your strategies you want to implement. And sometimes that's just as difficult as getting the funding, because most tribes are located in remote areas, and getting the resources to implement become an issue. So planning is very important, especially with the inclusion of tribal leadership and tribal members to help drive that plan and go through the process. Thanks. Right. Short term, what the tribe looked at was, what can we do right now with what we have to implement activities and projects that will be, benefit the tribe and its people in case a wildfire were to occur in the near future. What can we do with our existing staff, the existing funding we have, even if we didn't get any funding from another agency. So they looked at doing visual inspection of homes and the buildings, identifying where there were concerns around each. And there are wonderful forms online that you can get from different agencies that show you how to build out safe zones from the home outwards. So they create buffer zones, and those are easy to do, and they're critically important. And especially, I saw that a couple of months ago when we had a fire that was threatening the Ramona Reservation, and dealing with the different agencies and getting input and feedback from them during and after the incident. And then, with the inspections, creating the defensible space around the homes and buildings, clearing debris from around infrastructures, and other things that can be done using resources on hand. And as I said, these can be effective against spread and impacts of wildfire. They can also be effective if a wildfire does occur and it just moves so fast that the tribal members have to stay in place. Creating those buffers areas around their homes are important. So the short-term planning, even if you you're waiting to get funding for the long-term stuff that you've looked at, look at what you have available to you. And I know this is different for all tribes, but look what you have available to you and see what you can implement immediately or shortly. Next slide. Other plans. There are other plans that the tribe developed in conjunction with the actual strategies to help mitigate against wildfire that are just as important. An evacuation plan, a communication plan, emergency response plan. And we've also developed tribal ordinances that are part of our toolbox to combat wildfire and its impacts. Now, the communication plan, we worked with an agency. We got it for free, so I can provide that link. And then with an emergency response plan, we developed that under a grant that we got from EPA for a gap, and we're going to update that through a program with Cal OES, and they're going to do that for free. So there is available not the funds, but the assistance to do some of this stuff. And then let me tell you, during the event that we had in September, the evacuation plan was key, as well as a communication plan. Those were probably two of the biggest assets that we had, because in developing each of those, we had developed relationships with the agencies that were going to respond to the event, whether it was CAL FIRE, Riverside County Sheriff, and other state, federal, and local agencies. We had met and talked with those people. And I think I addressed that a little in the next slide. Yeah, exercising.
And actually, John, I'm so sorry to cut in. Would you mind wrapping up in about a minute, just so we have enough time for our next speaker? Okay, thank you. You're doing great.
With everything that what the tribe has developed, the strategies it's put in place, the plans that it's developed, exercising or having trainings with your staff within the tribe, or even with other tribes and other agencies, were very key in us finding what didn't work, making changes, updating, and it also helped us to coordinate, communicate, and consult with those agencies that were going to respond to the event. So get known is what I have on the bottom there. Make yourself known. Don't have it that they finally figure out who you are during the event. Make it happen before. Next slide. Yeah. Like I said, this is how Ramona approached this issue, some of the stuff it did. And we recognize that this is not how other tribes may approach it, because they have different resource issues, different structure. But we will gladly discuss our approach and answer any questions beyond this presentation. So thank you very much for allowing me to present, and I look forward to the rest of today and the rest of this event.
John, thank you so much. That was just perfect, and I feel like we could have a 2-hour conversation just kind of dissecting all the work that you guys are doing over there just on wildfires. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
We're going to take questions for both John and our next speaker right after she's done, if that's all right with everybody. So let me go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So Kendra Zanzao, did I say that correctly? She is the environmental program manager with the Chickaloon Native Village, and has some exposures and some strategies she wants to share as well. Thanks so much for doing that, Kendra. I'll leave it up to you. Do you need to be able to share your screen?
You can run the slides if you like.
Oh, did I get them? Hang on. Did you send them to me today?
Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as you emailed me, I sent them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Appreciate it. Just a moment. All right. Okay. There you go.
Okay, yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Kendra Zamzo. I'm an environmental chemist. I work for Chickaloon Native Village in Alaska. And next slide will show you where we are, where we're located. So this shows the state of Alaska, and that big blue area, that's the Matanuska-Susitna Borough. And if you look on the right in the circle, there's a little dot. That's Palmer, which is the big town. Palmer and Wasilla is just north of that. And our offices and most of our citizens or the Chickaloon citizens are just to the east of that dot. So we're on the road system. We're about 70 miles east of Anchorage. So that makes us a little different than a lot of the interior villages. Next slide. So just really briefly, we're in the process of developing our vulnerability assessment report. And as part of that, we're trying to capture what the community is concerned about and what their observations are. So these are some of the methods we've been using. I've been doing interviews. I've put out 3 surveys internally to staff to see how they get their water, how they heat their home, so kind of how they would be at risk. We sent out a survey to the wider community that we called outdoor activities, but it also included gardening, foraging, pets and livestock, so kind of a wide variety of kind of daily interactions. And then in February, last month, we did a climate fair that we spent a couple of months planning for. And the other half of this, we're looking at lived experience, but I'm also working with a climate team that I developed to actually write this report. And there are about 5 tribal citizens and staff and about 4 or 5 Western scientists that contribute to monthly meetings as a climate team. Next slide. So this is our climate fair that we held in Palmer. On the left, we were asking people to provide information to us on these posters or on maps. And we also had an option where we could record them if they wanted to. Nobody took us up on that, but we had it as an option. And to kind of stimulate them to think about things that maybe were in the back of their mind, we had some pictures, we had some prompting questions, and we're just encouraging them to write and draw on these big topic posters. We also had about 11 different organizations that came to provide information. And those were nonprofits, state agencies, our experiment farm that's just north of Palmer, the Alaska Native Tribal Health Center, and our Tribal Historic Preservation Office were all part of that. And you can also see in the foreground, there's a teenager who's writing on one of our posters that was on a table. So we tried to also put posters where people could gather around and write. So next slide. The topics we had at these information tables included animal diseases, which include both wildlife and backyard poultry, shellfish toxins, which the Kanik tribe next to us is researching, public health and health in general, energy, agriculture, we're the biggest agriculture area in Alaska, observation networks, both those set up by the federal government for snow surveys and by the Tribal Health Consortium, which is a network of local environmental observers, and then our Tribal Historic Preservation Office. We're also providing information. Next slide. What we were asking people to provide us feedback on were weather events, fish and wildlife changes, forest and plant changes, energy, infrastructure, community, and food and cultivation, or food access, food issues. And again, this was trying to get them to provide both their concerns and their observations. And next slide. The top concerns that came out of this event and other surveys that we did related to this event were wildfire and windstorms. Not surprising because these impacted thousands and thousands of people, and they do every year. So the people in the Matsu Borough, everybody has been exposed to wildfire in one way or another. We've either been evacuated or we've had close calls or we've been exposed to smoke. Most of us have experienced the windstorms, probably everybody in the borough. And that small, on the picture on the right, that shows a roof that was ripped off of one of our large grocery stores. We only have 2 grocery stores. This is one of them. And it was in January of 2022. It was iced up, pipes froze, roof was ripped off, and they still operated in order to get food and supplies out to people. So people go to really extraordinary measures when they can. And I've included a couple of quotes here from the posters. School was canceled for a week, no internet, intermittent power. We actually had 20,000 people without power during that event. Cars were overturned. What they didn't say here is also there's so much snow drifting, not only at this event, but other winter events. Snow drifts across the agricultural fields, blocks the roads, and people cannot get anywhere. You know, the roads are blocked. Lots of people that had broken pipes and no heat. So and this is starting to happen more frequently, not just January 2022, but it happened to some degree this winter as well. Next slide. This is also what our Matsu Borough is focused on, is these winter storms, strong winds, power outages. Next slide. What people are not focused on is heat. And this is something I wasn't that focused on either, except I was focused on streams warming and impacts on fish. I wasn't focused so much on us, because who doesn't like warm weather when you're in Alaska? But in 2019, we had a heat wave that really stuck with us. We also had a heat wave that stuck with us in May and June of last year. So in May, where I live, you might get 60, 65 degrees. We got 80 degrees in May. It was unheard of. And what was happening was there was this heat dome that was stuck over the Pacific, over us, and it was driving cold temperatures and rain into the entire Pacific Northwest, and it had us kind of baking up here. It's something that we don't think about, but an epidemiologist who's actually on my climate team just wrote a paper on heat illness and found that emergency visits increased when you started seeing temperatures at 70 degrees Fahrenheit in our borough, Matsu Borough. By the time you got to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, there was a significant increase. And all the things that you're aware of, respiratory issues, cardiovascular issues, these were compounded during smoky days. Our heat and smoke they're not necessarily linked. We can get smoke from local wildfires, but we're more likely to get smoke from Asia coming across the Pacific. So we could have smoke on cold days. We're not sure when they're going to intersect. The epidemiological study also found that Alaska natives were particularly susceptible to ischemia, which is lack of blood flow and oxygen during hot events and smoky events. So it was something they did not find in non-natives. So it's something that's new to me, these exposures. Next slide. Oh, I should also say, nobody has air conditioning. Nobody has air conditioning. Most people do not have well-insulated houses, so their houses are not going to stay cool. And so whenever there is a heat event, stores immediately run out of fans. People are just not prepared. And so there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people end up with no way to cool down. So our next steps, the reason I'm showing this slide again is not only does it show the populated areas in Alaska, but those 4 little dots in the circle off to the right, those are also the only place where the state monitors air quality in the entire state. So one of the actions that we want to look at is getting out these low-cost air sensors. They're starting to be distributed, but I think there's only 4 right now in the Matsu Borough. That's something we could easily do as a tribe, start getting this out. That at least measures particulates and humidity, and then we could maybe find a way to tie that into temperature. We need to do a lot more outreach on the symptoms of heat illness and how to handle it. I know when I was talking to a group of 5 youth, 2 of them had heat exhaustion and had no place to go, couldn't afford a doctor, didn't know what to do. So we need to do a lot of outreach on this. And we're in the process of doing master planning. So we need to be thinking about how do we integrate cooling centers as we develop a museum, more offices, more housing, and make sure that those centers, whatever facility that is, has kitchens, bathrooms, room for multiple families. So this is some of this is really kind of a new idea of exposures is heat illness in this area. And that's all I've got. We also have wildfires. And the tribe is doing a lot of what John, we are clearing around tribal housing. We're making fuel breaks. We're working on a lot of that too. Yeah. So,
Thank you, Kendra.
This
That
is-
was very fascinating. Was that Shasta?
Oh, I didn't say anything. I'm just nodding.
No, I heard someone else. Okay, well, yeah, both of those were really great. Gosh, I love getting these insights. And I wish we had longer for both. We have a few minutes for a couple of questions. There was a question here in the chat from Lori. Mr. Gomez, you touched on this briefly, but this is a huge amount of heavy labor. RBC doesn't have that many strong backs available that I know of. Who and how do you all do all this with the care it deserves and not end up hiring outside yahoos who just destroy the lands? Thank you.
That's a great question. When I started, the tribal leaders had developed some really good relationships with other tribes. So, for example, the fuel break that surrounds the reservation was done through a cooperation with Sequan. They had a type 1 hand crew that came in and helped put in that fuel break that still exists, and we maintained that. Believe it or not, Ramona has a large heavy equipment depot. We have a dozer, we have blades, we have other pieces of equipment that we use, that we have used since then, to maintain those types of the fuel breaks and do work around the reservation. We have qualified operators that are employed by the tribe and have been employed by the tribe in the past. When we do have to go out and hire people, I do my best not to hire yahoos, but we've also have complete control over the process. We do not allow anybody to do any work on the reservation unless they agree to comply with tribal laws and ordinances regarding protection of resources, environmental protection issues, hazardous waste. All of those things they have to comply with, as well as the scope of work that's developed by the tribe. And there'll be a tribal representative at the site at all times. So we've hired people to come out and do hazardous fuels reduction in areas on the reservation using NRCS funds, and we're out there with them. And we've identified vendors that we've continued to use because they are responsible and respectful to the tribe. And I think that's an important issue too, is to try and find those type of vendors that you can rely on and that are going to be respectful and responsible to what the tribe wants done. So.
Thanks, John. And, I really appreciate both of you getting specific about what this really looks like to try to act on these things. Really helpful to get this inside view. And Dee Moya, I want to say Daniel, you have your hand raised for a long time. Do you still have a question, Daniel? Okay. Let's see here. I know there's some other good comments here in the chat. No other questions that I see. And, this has been really great because now we're going to go in where everybody gets to talk about their experiences. So if you heard something here and you want to dive in more, you may find John or Kendra in your group, but you get to kind of dive in and share a little bit about what you have worked on in terms of each of these exposures. So let's talk about how that's going to work. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to break out for 3 different times, and we have 3 groups. So Shasta and Tina and I are each going to facilitate a group. We have a mural board like we always do, and the mural board is set up so that, excuse me, each of the exposures, we're going to be able to take notes by exposure. But if you join the group for, let me actually pull that up so you can see what it looks like. And maybe Shasta, would you mind just reading out while I pull that up? Could you read out those questions just to give people the prompts?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to stick with the tribal health topic. So we want to talk about how your tribe or your community's health is being impacted by the exposure and its effects. And now I can't see them because Angie's mural page is on here. But you know what? That basically comes down to it. We're going to be talking about the effects of these exposures on health in our communities. What are the strategies that we've come up with, if any, or any suggestions that you can make about how you're going to manage these exposures. And we've got them all here on the mural board so that we can type them in and make this the basis for the wisdom well that we're going to create for today's webinar. So how this is going to work, we're going to have the 3 breakout rooms and we're going to have 15 minutes for each one. And there's the wildfire group, and then Angie is going to tackle the temperature extremes and drought in another room. And then I will be taking on storms and flooding and melting ice and sea level rise. And after 15 minutes, we'll be prompted for you all to choose a new group so that you spend a little bit of time in each one of the groups. So that's how this is going to go. It sounds complicated, but it's not. Tina has our rooms set up. And I think all it takes is for her to click the button and you automatically get sent to a room, I think, or you might have to choose one. You just decide where you want to go for the first one, and then we'll let you know when it's time to shift. Thank you so much, everybody. That was a really terrific discussion, and thank you for your patience with us shuffling you into the other rooms. But as you can see, we've got a lot of stuff. We didn't get a whole lot of melting ice and sea level rise because that doesn't seem to be a major impact for most of the folks who are on the call today, but we know that that's an impact for others. So we'll keep fleshing that out for our tribes that are going to be affected more by that. And I'm really hoping that we can find more resources too. So we'll think about some other resources we can put for each of these exposures. Angie, was there anything you wanted to say about the breakouts?
I mean, the wisdom well is full, so that was great. I really appreciated. I like timing. I like doing that. The repeated rotation was nice. I just want to leave like 1 or 2 opportunities for anybody who felt really had something they took away, any compelling thing they want to make sure it gets elevated up to the full group from the discussion that happened in these groups.
And feel free to either just speak up or raise your hand. We'll take it either way.
This is also, I wanted to say something quickly, that a lot of the problems that we're having with climate change and global warming and things that are affecting our lands, our tribal lands, is that there's a disconnect within the big society, the American society and the tribal nations about what we believe our values are and what we believe is important to us. And until we cross that gap or bridge it so that we all are on the same page that it is our duty to protect Mother Earth, then whatever comes our way as far as funding, policy, Forest Service policy, any policy, we're gonna have it. I think that's our biggest fight. It's not trying to deal with, the impacts of climate change. I think we have to deal with the people who don't want to change because they're built on industrialization and the impacts of making money. And what we're saying, the tribes are saying money's good, we have casinos, but we also, that money is given to us because we love Mother Earth. Until I think most Americans say that out loud, that we have to protect Mother Earth, I think tribes and the federal systems and the local system, county and state, are always going to be at odds because they're coming in from a scientific and technical point of view, and we're coming in from an ecological, everything counts. Because I'm looking at the 3 things we talked about today, I'm thinking there's a lot of funding out there, but why are we not getting our share of it directly? Why do we have to go to the process? What happened to the trust responsibility? So I thought I'd just throw that in there.
Thank you, Celso. Man, you couldn't have said it any better. And what Kendra put in the chat too, one of our youth said the root of climate change is capitalism, and I'm there too. And I'm also guilty. I like to have new clothes and shoes and chocolate, but you know what? Not at the expense of Mother Earth. So I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up. So let's just talk briefly about what's coming up for next month. Angie?
All right. I love this training. Just thanks so much for continuing to be part of it. I'm learning a lot with you. Just wanted to remind you, if you are working on your worksheet, worksheet 5, you can there's a reflection there. Just take a second after this and jot down any thoughts you want to make sure you remember from all of this. We'll be compiling all that great input into our wisdom well so that you could have it and other tribes can have it as well. The next reading for the next session, we're suggesting FEMA's National Tribal Strategy. And so this is a forward-looking report, and it's not super long, but at least take a scan because you might want to just know that it exists. And it's a good topic to talk about next month. It's not March 16th, it'll be in April. Sorry about that. The next, and it will be webinar 6. I didn't do this slide. Webinar 6 will be on coordinating climate adaptation and tribal disaster hazard mitigation and emergency management in public health. So it's like, what's the, the tie-in with all of these seemingly different fields? How are they coordinating? How can you coordinate that within tribes for your adaptation purposes? So that's what we'll do when we get together next month. And until then, contact us if you ever need any help with anything. And again, thank you so much for making the time to keep being here.
Yes, thank you, everybody. We will see you on April 13th for the next one. And until then, stay safe, stay dry, and we'll see you later.
Okay, bye.
Bye.